A small recap on what we saw far in this fourth unit, the context of the binding. We are going to talk and to define the technologies responsible for the support population of controls. Controls, we have actually two categories. The single value, let's say control, single value based, like the labels. One value we need to display the control, the populated control. Or the multi-valued controls, like the lists or list boxes or whatever, drop-down menus or grid views, that can acquire many values at the same time. The population, actually, it is our own now, and this is the definition of what the data binder means here. So this is as per the definition, and this is what we defined actually last class. So we continue from there. There are two main properties that we have to go beyond here, which are properties I said have two components. The first one is the specificity of what the source is, from where we are going to bring the data to populate controls. The second thing is the method responsible for doing the population. Means we're going to fill up a control with data. Who will do that? This method, data bind. The method, actually, because of these two parentheses here, actually, we're going to specify this is a method here because of the parentheses here. Good. Controls, actually, that we are going to tackle at the beginning, the lists, mainly the lists, via which we're going to understand how a binding happens. List boxes, drop-down list, actually a grid view, all of them, they are examples of lists that we can use to populate them using the data binding methodology. Okay, so binding means populating controls using data source and the method, which is the data bind. Good. Who will do that? Actually, an event handler. Remember that all the actions in the code behind file, they are actually triggered based on an event handler action. To trigger such binding behavior, in the majority of the cases, actually, they have to be done automatically. Once the page has been loaded, immediately controls have to be populated straightforward. To do so, it does not acquire the behavior of the user. To do so, we need actually such an automatic behavior, such an automatic triggering activity, which is enhanced using the page load event or the page pre-render event. Those are two very famous events that can trigger, can play the role of an event handler, and without the intervention of the user. Immediately, they would do the population. They would assure the binding of the controls automatically without waiting for the user to interfere. This does not mean that they are the unique event handlers for such behavior. No, we can go beyond launching a data binding activity using a user behavior, like clicking a button, clicking a link, a hyperlink, passing over, let's say, a label or something like that. All of it, they can play the role of an event handler. Yet, it depends on the scenario only. Yeah, it's a persistency. For what it concerns the lists in general, remember, a list, it would have many values of the same type. For example, we have a list of students displayed in a list box. Student 1, student 2, student 3, and so on. Okay. We need to display the profile of student number 1. Okay, we select the student number 1 and submit. The system, how do we know that we are specifying the student number 1? Saying that we have more than one student named Muhammad, for example. So which Muhammad profile we are going to display? Muhammad the first, the second, which Muhammad? We have, for example, 100 Muhammads. The system will fail. Because of this only, when binding a list, there are two major fields that they have to be filled carefully. The value, the text that has to be displayed to the user, the front end, and the value which is the data to be given to the system to index the value in question inside the list. For example, the ID or the mobile number or the email, something special but we never fail. We have many Muhammads, maybe, for example, but every Muhammad has his own and unique ID. So the list will have two values to fill accordingly when it talks about the binding here. Something to display to the user and something to display to the system, to point, to index. Great examples of lists here, just refer to that. The two properties, the text to display to the user and the ID to display to use as an index, they are not unique. There are other properties that list box or list in general will have actually, and will give us a chance to control based on the need. Usually, we may talk about the formatting, we might talk about actually the data from actually the way how to act when we pass an event like the text, the auto post back event, something like that. So there are other properties we may explore later on when we talk about the practical size, technically speaking here. This is a very good example of a list, but it is populated using the data binding, multi-data binding. We have actually a bulleted list. Here it is. It's an ASP solution. It's the front end. This is the front end solution. Bulleted list, drag and dropped from the toolbox. And we have actually in the code behind file here a variable declared with the name URLs. It's an array that has actually five different values. And the two behaviors here we have. The source is the URLs. The source, the data source. Here it is, the URLs, this one. And the action to do, yes, let's do the behavior. Let's do the binding. On what? The source linked to the bulleted list, and the binded on the bulleted list also. And this is the result. This is the final result at the end. The text, this is the one what we will see here. And the link, when we click it, this is the URL. So yes, so this is a good example here. Yeah. There are two main categories of binding, whether we are going to talk about lists like this example, which is multi-valued lists. So here we may talk about the repeated value binding, because the same way how we populate this Google, we will populate the Bing, we will populate the ABC search, all of them. So we are repeating the behavior again and again and again and again, the same scenario. So thus we talk about the repeated value binding here. We talk about the repeated value binding. Otherwise, if it is just single value display or to bind, we talk about single value or simple binding, simple data binding, something like that. So those are the two main categories of types of data binding here. What it concerns a one value binding, we say single value binding, or simply said simple data binding. It is to populate only one value based control. As we were discussing here, the multi-valued controls, they are to be populated using the repeated value binding or the list binding. Nomination is correct, and they actually use a data source to populate many values in the same control. Good. So actually the binding usually would be actually launched due to an event handler and the code behind file, remember that? So it will not run by itself. It will need an event handler, whatever. It's an automatic event handler or it's a user triggered event handler, but from the back code behind file. In our example here, we are using the C# to do so. The page load is one of the very good examples here to be an event handler, an automatic event handler, but it's not the unique event handler. It depends on the scenario usually. We may refer to others. So once the event handler has been launched, immediately the control will be actually, the data bin method will be activated, and thus the control will be populated automatically. So it's the role of the data bin to play the role of binding or populating the control, whether it is a single value binding, a simple binding, or repeated value binding, or list binding. A very good example here, when we talk about the single or the simple data binding, we have to have a control to display inside of it a one value, single value here. There is a specific annotation to use in order to populate a simple value using a single value using the simple data binding. The expression is as as follows. We have to respect the syntax here specifically. We have to start with the less than percentage hash. Then we type the variable name, the variable that has the value. It's a user-defined variable. It's not predefined. It's a user-defined, depends on the solution usually. However, we defined it in the code behind file. Here in the front end interface in the ASPX page, we are going to specify it. And then after we terminate our let's say here, tool, or let's say our simple control with the percentage greater than. This is an example here. This is an example. So a country here, it's a user-defined variable that has a name. And the code behind file to display actually whatever, depends on the solution here. This is what we can see, something like that. It's inside the control here, the page load. We are declaring a variable and initializing it with the value, let's say with 10. This is the declared variable, declared it here in the public. And here we are initializing it. Then after this.bin, whenever the page has been loaded, and every instance of this transaction count here would be replaced with 10 everywhere. And this page here, and this page here, and this class here, everywhere, the transaction count will be replaced with 10 once this data bin has been launched. Simple. This is an example of two types of simple bindle. The first one, we are using the transaction count, which is a fully user-defined variable. The second one, we are using system-defined, predefined actually, let's say class here, or let's say library defined in the browser we are using, or the user is using. Yes, okay, another way here actually of populating and here using the simple binding to populate actually a control. We are referring to a label here now. Label here. We are just referring to the label to put a text and concatenate it plus the text concatenated with the variable which is to be displayed from the code behind file here. So later on in the front end, the label called here in this example label dynamic would have this text there were plus its concatenation plus the number 10 here. Simply, it's another way how to use the population using the simple data binding. For what concerns actually the repeated value binding here is another scenario we are going to talk, which is an advanced format, and we have to follow up in order to respect, because remember, we are going to repeat the behavior again and again and again. The list, it might have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 values. It might have tens or maybe even hundreds of values. So we're going to repeat the process until we fill all the lists with the data using this repeated value binding. Remember that. It's not only a database to be utilized to populate a list from background. It's not only a database. We may use local data sources, local in the memory here in the cache. We may use local, let's say, stored data to populate controls using the repeated value binding here. We may use arrays. Yes. We may use other lists, stored lists. All of them, they can play the role of a data source for a multi-valued, like a list control to play the to be populated using the repeated value binding. So databases can play the role of a data source, and also local data, locally stored data, can be play the role of the data source also. Examples of locally stored data, we talk about the arrays. This is a good example here. We may talk about the data sets in general. All the data set components can play the role. Entities inside the local memory, the cache memory, can play the role of a local data to be utilized to populate controls using the repeated value binding. The same methodology will apply later on. Data source and data bind. So a very good example here, a very good example here. So we have actually a list which is defined here programmatically here, and the code behind file has been defined, and it is being populated with data. It is being populated here. See fruit.add, and we are adding those fruits names here to the list, which is here defined here with the name user defined name fruit. Good. Now, after specifying this source here, we are going to display this actually thing here, actually those fruits that we actually specify that they are inside an array list. We are going to populate them inside. The array list is something in the memory. It's not visible here in the front end. It is not being displayed. Remember, we are going to populate inside the list here. It's a control, this one. So what is the source here? We are specifying the source is the fruit. Is it? So the source for this list is the fruit. Then after we are calling the bin to populate this list item or list here from this source. Simple. So we have the source, which is an array list. Then this array list has a name. It is being specified to be the data source for this list box or list item, whatever. And then after the action, yes, do the binding. The order is passed here. You cannot swap the order here. You cannot swap the order here. We have to define the array list first. Then we populate the array list with the values. Then we specify the source for the list in the front end interface. Then we do the binding of this front end, let's say, list tool or control. Yeah, here it is in action, actually, in this scenario here. Not only a list box, like list item, like we saw in the other example. Here we are having more than one drop-down list box, radio button. So radio button list. Sorry. So we may use actually the same data source, the fruit, to populate many controls. We can do that absolutely. Here it is, and this is an example. The same source, which is local list, the fruit, and it is populating many controls. I'll stop here because the chapter 4 is about to be terminated, so I'll give you the recording just once. Now I'm going to send it to you now. Let me stop the recording. And unless you have any questions, please.